A millionaire gave $550 to a girl living on the streets to buy food and ease her hunger. The next morning, he saw her at the grave of his beloved who died 25 years ago. Edward Morgan sat silently in the backseat of his black luxury car, staring out at the bustling streets of Manhattan. The city, always alive, seemed indifferent to his solitude. Despite the noise of honking cars and pedestrians rushing to their destinations, Edward felt an eerie silence within him, a silence that had been his companion for 25 years. Every year, on this very day, he followed the same ritual. He would visit the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, carrying a bouquet of fresh white lilies, Sarah's favorite. The scent of the flowers was bittersweet, a reminder of the life they had shared and the life he had lost in an instant. It was a crisp autumn afternoon. The sky was overcast, casting a somber gray hue over the city. As Edward's car approached the cemetery gates, memories of that tragic day resurfaced, uninvited yet unavoidable. The sound of screeching tires, the shattering of glass, and then the deafening silence. That silence had never left him. "Mr. Morgan, we're here," said Charles, his loyal driver, breaking his train of thought. Edward nodded without speaking, clutching the bouquet tightly as he stepped out of the car. The crunch of fallen leaves under his polished shoes accompanied him as he walked through the cemetery's winding paths. He found the grave easily. He had been there so many times that he could navigate the path with his eyes closed. The marble headstone, engraved with Sarah's name and the words "beloved wife and mother," stood as a stark reminder of the life he once had. He knelt down, placing the lilies gently on the grave. "Another year, Sarah," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Another year without you, without Abigail." Abigail, his daughter, his light, his little girl who never got the chance to grow up. She had been only 5 years old when the accident happened. The thought of her innocent laughter, her tiny hands clutching his, haunted him every day. Edward sat by the grave for a while, lost in thought. He tried to imagine what Sarah would say if she could see him now. Would she be proud of the empire he had built? Or would she pity the man he had become, wealthy beyond measure, yet utterly alone? As the wind picked up, rustling the trees, Edward stood up and adjusted his coat. "I'll see you next year," he whispered, though the ache in his chest reminded him that his visits were all he could offer now. The drive back to Manhattan was quiet. Charles, understanding his employer's mood, didn't attempt to make conversation. Edward's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, but he kept them buried deep inside, as he always did. When they arrived at his penthouse, Edward headed straight to his study. The large room, lined with shelves of books he rarely touched, overlooked the shimmering skyline of New York City. He poured himself a glass of scotch and sank into the leather armchair by the window. As the evening wore on, Edward couldn't shake the heaviness in his chest. He had tried everything to fill the void left by Sarah and Abigail, throwing himself into his work, amassing wealth, supporting charities in their names. But nothing ever seemed to help that night, as the city's lights twinkled like stars. Edward made an impulsive decision. He needed air, a change of scenery. He left his penthouse and walked toward Central Park, a place he hadn't visited in years. The park was quieter than he expected, with only a few late-night joggers and the occasional dog walker. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the distant hum of the city felt oddly soothing. As he wandered deeper into the park, Edward noticed a small figure sitting on a bench near the fountain. A girl, no older than 10, sat hunched over, clutching her knees to her chest. She wasn't wearing shoes, and her thin jacket did little to shield her from the cold. Edward hesitated for a moment before approaching. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his voice breaking the silence. The girl looked up, her large, tear-filled eyes meeting his. I'm fine," she replied, though her trembling voice betrayed her. Edward knelt down, pulling off his scarf and wrapping it around her shoulders. "Where are your parents?" "My mom's sick," the girl whispered. "She's at home. We don't have money for food." The words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He reached into his wallet and pulled out several bills, $550 in total. Handing them to the girl, he said, "Take this, get food for you and your mom, and make sure you get some shoes, okay?" The girl stared at the money, her hands shaking as she accepted it. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you." "Thank you so much. You've saved us." Edward watched as the girl ran off into the night, clutching the money tightly for the first time in years. He felt something stir within him, an unfamiliar warmth, a faint flicker of hope. As he made his way back home, Edward couldn't shake the image of the girl from his mind. There was something about her that felt familiar, but he dismissed the thought, attributing it to his own grief and exhaustion. Little did he know that brief encounter would change his life forever. The following morning, Edward woke with a strange unease. The memory of the little girl from Central Park lingered in his mind, her tear-streaked face, the gratitude in her voice, and the desperation in her eyes. It all felt too vivid to ignore. Shaking off the feeling, he reminded himself that he had done a small good deed. Perhaps that was all there was to it. His morning routine proceeded as usual. After his coffee and a light breakfast, Edward decided to visit the cemetery once more. Something about the previous day's visit had left him unsettled. Though he couldn't quite pinpoint why, the drive to Greenwood was uneventful, and Charles, ever the discreet driver, said little beyond the occasional polite comment. Edward appreciated the silence, using the time to collect his thoughts. When they arrived, Edward stepped out of the car, clutching a fresh bouquet of white lilies. The sky was clearer than the day before, and the sun cast a pale golden light over the cemetery grounds. As he made his way along the familiar path, he noticed a small figure kneeling by Sarah's grave. At first, Edward assumed it was a coincidence. Perhaps someone else had come to pay their respects. But as he got closer, he recognized the tattered jacket and messy hair. It was the same girl he had met in Central Park. She was kneeling, her small hands pressed together in what seemed like prayer, her head bowed in quiet reverence. A pang of confusion and curiosity surged through Edward. What was she doing here? "Excuse me," he said cautiously, stepping closer. The girl jumped slightly at the sound of his voice, turning to face him with wide eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Edward's mind raced with questions, but it was the girl who broke the silence. I didn't mean to intrude," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "This is my grandmother's grave. I come here when I can." Edward froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Your grandmother?" The girl nodded, pointing to the headstone. "Sarah Morgan. She was my mom's mother. My mom always told me she was a kind and loving person. I just wanted to say hello to her." Edward's world tilted. The weight of her words pressed on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He stared at the headstone, the name that he had read countless times before, now taking on an entirely new significance. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Zoe," she replied. "And your mother?" "Abigail," Zoe said, her eyes lighting up slightly at the mention of her mother. "She talks about my grandma a lot. She says she's watching over us." Edward felt the ground shift beneath him. It couldn't be. Abigail had died in that crash. He had mourned her for years, visited her supposed resting place, carried the weight of her loss every single day. And yet, here was this girl, claiming to be Abigail's daughter. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Zoe," he said gently, Does Abigail ever talk about her father?" Zoe hesitated, as if unsure how to answer. "Not really," she admitted. "She says he was really sad when my grandma died. She doesn't talk about him much." Edward's hands shook as he processed her words. It didn't make sense, yet the pieces were falling into place. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "Where is your mother, Zoe?" he asked. "Can I meet her?" Zoe's expression turned wary. "She's at home. She's not feeling well." "But why do you want to meet her?" Edward hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I think I might know her," he said. "I just want to talk to her, that's all." Zoe frowned, but nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, "but I have to ask her first. She doesn't like strangers coming to our house." Edward nodded, understanding her caution. "That's fair," he said. He reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. "This has my number. If your mom agrees, tell her to call me, okay?" Zoe took the card, studying it carefully before tucking it into her pocket. "I'll tell her," she promised as she stood to leave. Edward's mind buzzed with 1,000 questions. How could Abigail be alive? Why had he been told she was gone? And what kind of life had she been living all these years? He watched as Zoe walked away, her small frame disappearing down the path. A mixture of hope and dread swirled within him. When Edward returned to the car, Charles noticed the change in his demeanor. "Everything all right, sir?" "No, Charles," Edward said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Everything is far from all right." The drive back to Manhattan was silent, but Edward's mind was anything but. He needed to know the truth, and he would stop at nothing to find it. Back in his penthouse, Edward paced the length of his study. The polished wooden floors seemed to groan under the weight of his restlessness. Every time he tried to calm his mind, Zoe's words echoed back. "Abigail. She's my mom." It was impossible. He had buried Abigail, or so he thought. The idea that Abigail might be alive was both thrilling and terrifying. What if Zoe was mistaken? What if this was all some cruel twist of fate, and the girl's connection to Sarah was merely a coincidence? But the way Zoe spoke about her grandmother, it was too specific, too personal. Unable to sit with his thoughts any longer, Edward reached for his phone and dialed the number of the one person who could help him unravel this mystery. James Whitmore, a private investigator he had hired for sensitive matters in the past. "James, it's Edward Morgan," he said, when the line connected. His voice was firm, though a hint of urgency seeped through. "I need you to look into something for me, immediately." "Of course, Mr. Morgan, what's the matter?" James's tone was professional, but Edward could sense his curiosity. Edward hesitated. He wasn't ready to explain everything. "There's a young girl named Zoe. I need you to find out everything about her and her mother, Abigail. Start with records from Greenwood Cemetery, then check the hospitals and the archives from 25 years ago. Something about the accident that killed my wife and daughter doesn't add up." James didn't question the request. "I'll get on it right away," he assured Edward, ending the call. Edward felt a flicker of hope, but it was accompanied by a heavy dread. If Abigail was alive, where had she been all these years? And why hadn't she come back to him? Over the next few days, Edward threw himself into work, trying to distract himself from the gnawing anxiety. Meetings with board members and discussions about upcoming projects filled his schedule, but his thoughts kept drifting to Zoe and Abigail by the third evening. Edward's patience was wearing thin. He had heard nothing from James, and the silence was maddening. He poured himself a glass of scotch and sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the lights of Manhattan twinkle against the night sky. It all felt so hollow without anyone to share it with. Just as he finished his drink, his phone buzzed. It was James. "Edward," the investigator began, his voice tinged with hesitation. "I've found something." Edward's heart pounded. "What is it?" "There's no death certificate for Abigail Morgan," James said. "Not in the hospital records, not in the state archives. There's a record of Sarah's passing, but nothing for Abigail. It's as if she disappeared without a trace." Edward gripped the phone tightly. "What about the orphanages? Did you check those?" "I did," James replied. "There's a file on an Abigail Doe, who was taken in by a state-run orphanage a few months after the accident. The details match your daughter's age and physical description. She was adopted at the age of 7. The room seemed to spin around Edward. "Who adopted her? Where is she now?" "The adoption records are sealed," James said, "but I'm working on getting access in the meantime. I tracked Abigail's recent history through public records. She married at 21, but it seems the marriage didn't last long. There are court documents indicating a restraining order against her ex-husband, followed by a custody agreement for her daughter Zoe." Edward felt his chest tighten. His daughter, his Abigail, had been alive all this time, suffering through unimaginable hardships while he had been living in luxury. The thought was unbearable. "Where is she now?" he demanded. "She's living in a small apartment in Brooklyn," James said. "It's not in the best condition. I can give you the address." Edward didn't hesitate. "Send it to me." The address arrived within minutes, and Edward wasted no time. He called Charles to prepare the car and left the penthouse, his mind racing as the car wove through the busy streets of Manhattan. Edward couldn't help but wonder how Abigail would react to seeing him. Would she remember him? Would she want anything to do with him after all these years? When they arrived, Edward stepped out into a quiet, run-down neighborhood. The building was old and crumbling, with peeling paint and cracked windows. It was a far cry from the life he had envisioned for Abigail. He hesitated at the entrance, his hand hovering over the buzzer labeled A. Morgan. Taking a deep breath, he pressed it. Moments later, a faint voice crackled through the intercom. "Who is it?" Edward's voice caught in his throat. "It's Edward Morgan. I'd like to speak with you." There was a long pause. Then, the door buzzed open as he climbed the narrow staircase. Edward's heart pounded in his chest. When he reached the 3rd floor, the door to Abigail's apartment was slightly ajar. He stepped inside cautiously, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. "Abigail," he called out from the small living room. A woman emerged. Her face was thinner than he remembered, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but there was no mistaking her. It was her, his daughter. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. In that moment, 25 years of pain and separation dissolved into an overwhelming wave of emotion. Edward stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "It's me," he said softly. "I've been looking for you." Abigail stared at him, her expression a mixture of shock, anger, and relief. "You found me," she murmured. "After all this time, you found me." The silence in the room was deafening. Edward and Abigail stood a few feet apart, both overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. Zoe peeked out from behind her mother, her wide eyes darting between the two. The little girl's innocent presence seemed to cut through the tension, grounding the room in a way neither Edward nor Abigail could manage. "I don't even know what to say," Abigail said finally, her voice breaking. She crossed her arms, her posture defensive. Edward took a hesitant step forward. "You don't have to say anything," he replied, his voice soft. I can't believe you're here. I thought I lost you forever." Abigail's expression hardened slightly. "You did lose me. 25 years, Dad. 25 years. And not once did I hear from you. Do you know what that does to someone? To a child?" Her words hit Edward like a hammer, each syllable filled with pain and resentment. He swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. "Abigail, I swear, I was told you were gone. They told me you died in the accident. I grieved for you every single day." Abigail's eyes softened, but only slightly. "And you just believed them. You didn't think to dig deeper, to make sure." Edward faltered. The truth was, he had accepted what he was told because it was easier than questioning it. He had been consumed by his own grief, too shattered to think clearly. "I failed you," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have done more. I should have fought harder." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Zoe shifted uncomfortably, her small hand clutching her mother's. "Mom," she whispered, breaking the silence. "Are you mad at him?" Abigail sighed, crouching down to meet Zoe's gaze. "No, sweetie," she said gently. "I'm not mad, I'm just confused. This is a lot to process." Zoe nodded, her lips curving into a small smile. "He's nice. He helped us in the park, remember?" Abigail looked up at Edward, her defenses softening further. "You were the man in the park." Edward nodded. "I didn't know who you were, who Zoe was. I just saw a little girl in need and I couldn't ignore her." Abigail's shoulders slumped, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She gestured toward the worn couch. "We should sit. I think we both have a lot of questions." As they settled into the cramped living room, Edward took in his surroundings. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, the walls stained with years of neglect. It was a stark contrast to the life he had built for himself, and guilt twisted in his stomach at the thought of his daughter growing up in such hardship. Abigail folded her hands in her lap, her expression guarded. "So, what exactly happened after the accident? How could you think I was dead?" Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The police told me Sarah and you were both gone. I didn't question it. I was too devastated. I buried your mother and what I thought was you." Abigail's brow furrowed. "But I survived. I was taken to an orphanage. How did no one realize I was alive?" "I don't know," Edward admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I've hired an investigator to uncover the truth. All I know now is that I failed you, and for that, I'm so sorry." Abigail's eyes glistened, but she quickly blinked back her tears. "I don't even know how to feel about this," she confessed. "Part of me wants to scream at you for not finding me sooner, but another part of me, I don't know. I don't expect you to forgive me," Edward said softly. "Not yet, maybe not ever, but I want to make things right. For you, for Zoe, Please, let me help." Abigail hesitated, her protective instincts kicking in. "Help how?" "Whatever you need," Edward said earnestly. "A better home, financial support, anything to make your lives easier. I've failed you for so long. I just want to be here for you now." Zoe, who had been quietly observing the conversation, tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, can we trust him?" Abigail looked at her daughter, then back at Edward. There was something in his eyes, an honesty, a vulnerability, that made her pause. She didn't trust easily. Years of hardship had taught her to be cautious. But this man sitting before her, offering his hand after so much time, was her father. "I don't know, Zoe," she said finally, "but maybe we can give him a chance." Edward left the apartment that evening with a heavy heart, but a glimmer of hope. Abigail hadn't rejected him outright, and that was more than he had expected. As Charles drove him back to Manhattan, Edward resolved to do whatever it took to earn his daughter's trust. The next morning, he called James. "I want you to keep digging," he said. "I need to know exactly what happened to Abigail after the accident, and find out everything you can about her ex-husband. If he hurt her, I want to know." James agreed, without hesitation. Edward hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city skyline. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just living for himself anymore. He was living for Abigail and Zoe. But as he prepared to move forward, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that there were still more secrets to uncover, hidden in the shadows of the past. The day after their emotional reunion, Edward couldn't stop thinking about Abigail and Zoe. The weight of the years they'd been apart was heavy on his mind, and he knew there was still so much left unsaid. Determined to understand what his daughter had endured, he arranged to meet her again, this time on her terms. Abigail agreed to let Edward visit their apartment that evening. Though she was hesitant, the small space was a stark reminder of the struggle she had faced, and she wasn't sure how much she wanted to share. Still, she felt a sliver of curiosity about the man who had once been her father, and what role he might now play in her and Zoe's lives. When Edward arrived, the atmosphere in the apartment was tense, but not unfriendly. Zoe greeted him with a shy smile, her natural warmth breaking some of the ice. Edward brought a small bouquet of flowers, handing them awkwardly to Abigail. "They're nothing compared to the ones I used to bring your mother," he said softly, "but I thought they might brighten your home." Abigail accepted the flowers with a nod, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said. She set them on the kitchen counter and motioned for Edward to sit. Once they were seated, Edward looked at Abigail, his gaze earnest. "I want to hear your story," he said. "Everything you've been through. I need to understand." Abigail hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting together. "It's not an easy story to tell," she admitted, "and I don't know if you're ready to hear it." "Please," Edward urged. "Whatever you're comfortable sharing, I'll listen." Abigail took a deep breath, her eyes distant as she began to speak. "I don't remember much about the accident," she said. "I was just a little girl. I remember the sound of metal crunching, glass breaking, and then nothing. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. They told me I had been in a car crash and that my mother had died." Edward's heart clenched at her words. The thought of his little girl waking up alone in a hospital, scared and confused, was almost too much to bear. "They said no one had come to claim me," Abigail continued, her voice tinged with bitterness. "So, they sent me to an orphanage. I waited, thinking someone, anyone, would come for me, but no one ever did." Edward leaned forward, his hands gripping his knees. "Abigail, She held up a hand, stopping him. "Let me finish," she said. "The orphanage wasn't a terrible place, but it wasn't a home either. I learned to take care of myself pretty quickly. When I was 7, a couple adopted me. They were kind but distant. I think they wanted a child to fill a void in their lives, not because they really wanted me." Her words hung heavy in the air. Edward's guilt deepened with every sentence. "I grew up feeling like I didn't belong anywhere," Abigail continued. "When I turned 18, I left and tried to build a life on my own. That's when I met David." Edward stiffened at the mention of a name he didn't recognize. "David," Abigail nodded, her eyes clouding over. "He was charming at first, said all the right things, made me feel like I was special. We got married when I was 21, but it didn't take long for things to change. He became controlling, then abusive. When I found out I was pregnant with Zoe, I knew I had to get out. I couldn't raise her in that environment. Edward's jaw tightened. The idea of someone hurting Abigail filled him with a fury he hadn't felt in years. I left him when Zoe was 2, Abigail said. I had nothing. No money, no family to turn to. We bounced between shelters and cheap apartments for years. I did what I could to provide for her, but it was never enough. She looked at Edward then, her expression a mixture of vulnerability and defiance. That's been my life, Dad. Scraping by, doing whatever it takes to keep Zoe safe and fed. And now, here you are. After all this time, I don't even know what to think. Edward took a deep breath, his throat tight with emotion. Abigail, I can't even begin to imagine what you've been through. But I need you to know. I had no idea you were alive. If I had known, I would have done everything to find you. I would have moved heaven and earth. Abigail's eyes softened slightly, though doubt lingered in her expression. I want to believe you, she said. But it's hard. After everything, it's hard to trust anyone. Edward nodded, understanding her hesitation. I don't expect you to trust me overnight, he said. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Let me help you, Abigail. Let me be the father I should have been. Before Abigail could respond, Zoe appeared in the doorway, clutching a worn teddy bear. Mom, are you okay? She asked, her small voice filled with concern. Abigail smiled and held out her arms. I'm okay, sweetie, she said, pulling Zoe into a hug. Edward watched the exchange, his heart aching with both pride and regret. He saw so much of Abigail and Zoe, the same resilience, the same quiet strength. Zoe, Edward said gently, how about we go to the park tomorrow? Just the 3 of us. We can get some ice cream, maybe feed the ducks. Zoe's face lit up. Really? Abigail hesitated, glancing at Edward. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she said, but just the park, nothing more. Edward smiled, grateful for even the smallest opportunity to spend time with them. The park it is, he said. As he left that evening, Edward felt a flicker of hope. It was a small step, but it was a step forward, and he would take every step he could to rebuild the family he thought he had lost forever. The next morning, Edward woke with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. For years, his days had been defined by rigid schedules and business decisions, each moment meticulously planned. But today felt different. Today, he wasn't Edward Morgan the mogul. He was Edward Morgan the father, trying to reconnect with the family he had thought lost forever. Charles pulled up to the modest apartment building right on time. Edward stepped out of the car, clutching a small bag in one hand. Inside were a few toys he'd picked out for Zoe, a teddy bear, some art supplies, and a kite. He wasn't sure what she liked, but he wanted to make an effort. When Abigail and Zoe appeared, Edward couldn't help but smile. Abigail had dressed casually, her guarded expression softening slightly when she saw him. Zoe, on the other hand, was beaming, her excitement bubbling over as she skipped toward him. You're early, Abigail said, crossing her arms but with a faint smile tugging at her lips. I didn't want to miss a second, Edward replied, his tone light but sincere. Zoe tugged on Abigail's hand. Mom, can we go now? I want to fly the kite Mr. Edward brought. She pointed to the bag, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. It's just Edward, he corrected gently, kneeling to meet her eye level. And yes, let's go. The park's waiting for us. The drive to Central Park was filled with Zoe's chatter. She talked about her favorite cartoons, the park's duck pond, and her dream of one day riding a pony. Edward listened intently, marveling at her boundless energy and how much she reminded him of a young Abigail. When they arrived, the autumn air was crisp and the park was alive with activity. Families picnicked on the grass, joggers passed by, and children played tag under the colorful canopy of leaves. Where should we start? Edward asked, looking at Zoe. The kite, she exclaimed, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward an open field. Abigail followed at a distance, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. Edward noticed her hesitation but decided not to push. Instead, he focused on Zoe, helping her assemble the kite and showing her how to hold the string. Ready? He asked, holding the kite high above his head. Ready? Zoe said. gripping the string tightly. Edward gave the kite a light toss, and with the wind's help, it soared into the air. Zoe squealed with delight, running across the field as she let out more string. Her laughter was infectious, and Edward felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through him. Abigail watched from a nearby bench, her expression unreadable. Seeing her daughter laugh so freely stirred something deep within her. She had worked so hard to protect Zoe, to shield her from the harsh realities of their life. And now, for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe things could be different. After the kite, Edward suggested they visit the duck pond. Zoe skipped ahead, tossing bits of bread to the ducks while Edward and Abigail trailed behind. "She's incredible," Edward said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've done an amazing job raising her." Abigail glanced at him, surprised by the compliment. "I did what I had to do," she said simply. "It hasn't been easy." Edward nodded. "I can see that, and I want to help, Abigail. Not just with money, though you'll never have to worry about that again, but with everything. Whatever you need." Abigail stopped walking and turned to face him. "Why now, Edward? Why do you care so much all of a sudden? Where was this care when I needed it most?" Her words stung, but Edward knew she was right to question him. "Because I didn't know you were alive," he said earnestly. "If I had known, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you. I thought I lost you, Abigail. I thought I lost both of you. And now that I know the truth, I don't want to waste another second." Abigail's gaze softened, though her walls didn't come down completely. "It's going to take time," she said. "You can't just show up and fix everything overnight." "I understand," Edward said, "but I'm not going anywhere. Whatever it takes, I'll do it." They spent the rest of the afternoon wandering the park, letting Zoe take the lead. They stopped for ice cream, which Zoe eagerly devoured, giggling when it dripped onto her jacket. Edward offered to buy her a new one, but Abigail waved him off, insisting it was fine. As the sun began to set, the trio found themselves sitting on a bench, watching the golden light filter through the trees. Zoe leaned against Abigail, her energy finally waning, while Edward sat quietly beside them. "Thank you," Abigail said softly, breaking the silence. "For today." "Zoe hasn't laughed like that in a long time." Edward turned to her, his expression gentle. "She deserves to laugh, so do you." Abigail didn't respond, but a faint smile played on her lips. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better when Edward dropped them off at their apartment. Zoe hugged him tightly. "Can we do this again?" she asked, her voice sleepy but hopeful. "Of course," Edward said, his heart swelling. "Anytime you want." Abigail lingered at the door as Zoe ran inside. "Good night, Edward," she said, her tone cautious but not cold. "Good night, Abigail," he replied, "and thank you for giving me this chance." As the door closed, Edward felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for the first time, he felt like he was truly on the path to healing the wounds of the past. The next morning, Edward sat in his study, reviewing a file that James Whitmore, the private investigator, had delivered late the previous night. The folder contained details about Abigail's life after the accident, her years in the orphanage, her adoption, and the turbulent years that followed. It was a painful read, but Edward forced himself to absorb every word. One page, in particular, caught his attention. A report about David, Abigail's ex-husband. The words domestic abuse and restraining order jumped out at him like glaring red flags. Edward's jaw tightened as he read the allegations. This man had not only hurt Abigail physically, but had also left her and Zoe in dire financial straits when he disappeared. Edward closed the file and leaned back in his chair, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. How had his daughter endured so much without him? The guilt was suffocating. He picked up his phone and dialed James. "James, thank you for the file," Edward began, his voice steady but firm. "But I need more. I want everything there is to know about David. Where he is, what he's doing now. Everything. I'll get right on it," James replied. "But Edward, be careful. Digging into someone like him could stir up trouble." "I'm not afraid of trouble," Edward said curtly. "Just find him." Later that day, Edward returned to Abigail's apartment. This time, he came with a proposal. He knocked on the door, and when Abigail answered, her expression was a mix of curiosity and cautiousness. "Twice in 1 week," she teased lightly. "I'm not sure if I should be flattered or worried." Edward chuckled, though his tone quickly turned serious. "I wanted to talk to you about something important. May I come in?" Abigail stepped aside, letting him enter. Zoe was in the corner of the small living room, coloring in a notebook. She waved at Edward with a cheerful smile before returning to her drawing. "Have a seat," Abigail said, gesturing toward the couch. Edward sat, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Abigail, I know you've been through more than anyone should ever have to endure, and I want to help. But I also know that offering money or a better apartment isn't enough." Abigail tilted her head, curious but wary. "What are you getting at?" "I want you and Zoe to come stay with me." "In my home," Edward said, his words measured. "I know it's a big ask, and I don't expect an answer right away, but I want you to think about it." Abigail stared at him, her brows furrowing. "Why would we do that? This is our home. It's not much, but it's ours." Edward nodded. "I understand, but think about what it could mean for Zoe. A better neighborhood, better schools, a chance to grow up without the struggles you've had to face, and for you, a chance to heal, to build something new without the weight of the past holding you down." Abigail looked away, her gaze falling on Zoe. Her daughter deserved better. That much she knew. But moving into Edward's world felt like a leap she wasn't ready to take. "I'll think about it," she said finally, "but I'm not promising anything. That's all I ask," Edward replied. That evening, Abigail found herself unable to sleep. She sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Edward's offer played on a loop in her mind. Part of her wanted to accept, to give Zoe the life she deserved, but another part of her feared the implications. Letting Edward back into her life, trusting someone who had been absent for so long. The sound of Zoe's soft snores from the bedroom brought a small smile to her lips. Abigail knew she had to do what was best for her daughter, even if it meant stepping out of her comfort zone. The next morning, over breakfast, Abigail decided to ask Zoe what she thought. "Zoe," she began carefully, "how would you feel about spending more time with your grandpa? Maybe even staying at his house for a little while?" Zoe's eyes lit up. "Really? His house is so big, it's like a castle." Abigail chuckled. "It's not a castle, sweetie, but yes, it's very nice." "Can we bring my teddy bear?" Zoe asked. "Of course," Abigail said, her heart softening at her daughter's excitement. Later that day, Abigail called Edward. "I've thought about your offer," she said, her voice steady but tinged with nervousness. "We'll stay with you for a while, but just until I figure things out." Edward's relief was palpable, even through the phone. "Thank you, Abigail," he said. "I'll make sure everything is ready for you. Take your time packing, and let me know when you're ready." 2 days later, Edward stood at the door of his penthouse as Abigail and Zoe arrived. Zoe's eyes went wide as she took in the grand marble floors, the towering windows, and the sweeping view of the city. "This is where you live?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. "Yes," Edward said, smiling down at her. "And now it's your home too." Abigail stepped inside cautiously, her gaze darting around the space. It was overwhelming, so different from the cramped apartment they had left behind. Edward led them to their rooms, which had been carefully prepared. Zoe's room was filled with toys and books, and Abigail's had a soft, inviting bed with fresh flowers on the nightstand. As the evening wore on, they settled in. Edward cooked dinner himself, a simple pasta dish that Zoe declared the best ever. Abigail, though still guarded, found herself relaxing slightly. For the first time in years, there was a sense of stability, a sense of hope. But in the back of Edward's mind, he knew their journey was far from over. There were still questions to be answered and wounds to heal, and lurking in the shadows was the specter of David, the man who had caused so much pain. Edward vowed silently that he would protect Abigail and Zoe at all costs, even if it meant confronting the darkness of the past head-on. The first few days at Edward's penthouse were a whirlwind of adjustments. For Zoe, the change felt like stepping into a fairy tale. She roamed the expansive rooms with wide eyes, marveling at the chandeliers and the view of the Manhattan skyline. Abigail, on the other hand, found herself struggling to settle in. The luxury surrounding her felt foreign, almost suffocating, as if it served as a reminder of how far apart she and her father's lives had been for so many years. Edward, aware of Abigail's discomfort, made a conscious effort to give her space. He spent most of his time with Zoe, playing board games, reading stories and listening to her endless chatter. Her laughter filled the penthouse, a sound Edward hadn't heard in far too long. But no matter how much joy Zoe brought, Edward's heart remained heavy with the unspoken tension between him and Abigail. He knew their relationship couldn't be repaired overnight, but he hoped that time and patience would bring them closer. One evening, after Zoe had gone to bed, Edward found Abigail in the kitchen, standing by the window with a cup of tea in her hands. The city lights illuminated her face, casting a soft glow on her features. For a moment, she looked so much like Sarah that Edward felt a pang of nostalgia. "Can't sleep?" Edward asked gently, stepping into the room. Abigail turned, startled by his voice. "No, not really," she admitted. "It's still strange being here." Edward nodded, leaning against the counter. "I can imagine this isn't exactly homey." Abigail let out a small laugh, surprising them both. That's one way to put it. They fell into a comfortable silence, the hum of the city outside filling the space. After a moment, Edward spoke again. "Abigail, I want to thank you for giving me this chance," he said. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful." Abigail sighed, setting her cup down on the counter. "It's not about deserving, Dad. It's about Zoe. She deserves to have a family, to know where she comes from. That's why I'm here." "I understand," Edward said, "but I also hope, in time, you'll come to see this as your home too." Abigail hesitated, her gaze softening. "Maybe, but it's going to take time." "I'm not going anywhere," Edward assured her. Over the next few weeks, small moments began to chip away at the walls Abigail had built around herself. She watched as Edward poured his energy into building a relationship with Zoe, showing a tenderness she hadn't expected from him. He taught Zoe how to ride a bike in the building's courtyard, cheered her on at school, and even joined her in baking cookies, though his culinary skills left much to be desired. One afternoon, Abigail found herself laughing as she watched Zoe smear flour all over Edward's face during their baking session. It was a simple moment, but it felt monumental, a glimpse of what a real family could look like. "Looks like I need some lessons," Edward joked, wiping his face with a towel. "Clearly," Abigail teased, her smile genuine for the first time in days. As they grew more comfortable in the penthouse, Edward decided it was time to address something important. He invited Abigail to join him in his study one evening, while Zoe was engrossed in a movie. "I wanted to show you something," Edward said, gesturing toward a large photo album on his desk. Abigail approached cautiously, her curiosity piqued. Edward opened the album, revealing pages filled with photos of Sarah, Abigail, and himself from years ago. "I've kept these all this time," Edward said softly. "I couldn't let go of them. They were all I had left of you and your mother." Abigail's fingers hovered over a picture of herself as a toddler, sitting on Sarah's lap with a wide grin. "I remember this day," she murmured. "We went to the park, and Mom let me feed the ducks." Edward smiled. "She loved taking you to the park. You two would stay there for hours, and I'd have to drag you both home when it got dark." The memories stirred something deep within Abigail, a longing for the family she had lost, and a tentative hope that it could somehow be rebuilt. "I wish she were here," Abigail said quietly. "So do I," Edward replied. "But I think she'd be proud of you, of the woman you've become, and the way you've raised Zoe." Abigail blinked back tears, her defenses lowering. For the first time, she allowed herself to see Edward not as the man who hadn't been there, but as a father who was trying to make amends. Later that night, Abigail sat on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle like stars. She thought about everything Edward had said, the effort he was making, and the love he was showing. Zoe, maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to let him back into her life. Inside, Edward stood by the window, watching Abigail from a distance. He knew they still had a long way to go, but tonight felt like a step in the right direction. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope that his family could truly heal. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of rebuilding trust and adjusting to a new rhythm of life. Zoe had settled into her new routine with ease, delighting in her new school and the opportunities it brought. She had made friends quickly, her laughter often echoing through the penthouse as she shared stories of her day. For Abigail, however, the transition was slower. Each day brought small moments of connection with Edward, moments that reminded her of the bond they once shared. Yet, doubts lingered, and the wounds of the past were not so easily healed. Edward, determined to give Abigail and Zoe a sense of stability, planned a weekend trip to the countryside. He hoped that time away from the bustling city might offer them a chance to connect further. On a crisp Saturday morning, Edward and Charles loaded their bags into the car. Abigail appeared in the doorway, hesitant but holding Zoe's hand. "This feels a bit extravagant," Abigail remarked, eyeing the sleek black SUV. "It's just a short getaway," Edward said with a warm smile. "Nothing extravagant about fresh air and open skies." Zoe's excitement was palpable. "Are there horses?" she asked eagerly. Edward chuckled. "I think we can arrange that." The drive to the countryside was scenic, with the city's skyscrapers giving way to rolling hills and golden fields. Edward pointed out landmarks along the way, trying to engage Abigail in conversation, though her responses were brief. There was a noticeable ease in her demeanor. When they arrived at the estate, Zoe gasped in awe. The property was expansive, with lush green lawns, a charming cottage, and a stable in the distance. "It's beautiful," Abigail admitted, her voice soft. "I'm glad you think so," Edward said, leading them inside. The weekend unfolded with surprising ease. Zoe was enchanted by the horses, spending hours at the stable with a patient trainer who helped her learn the basics of riding. Abigail watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride. As Zoe's confidence grew, Edward took the opportunity to spend time with Abigail, inviting her to join him on walks around the property. On one such walk, they found themselves by a quiet lake, the water shimmering under the afternoon sun. "This place feels like a dream," Abigail said, gazing out at the water. "It's one of my favorite spots," Edward said. "I used to come here when things got overwhelming. It always helped me think." Abigail glanced at him. "What are you thinking about now?" Edward hesitated, then spoke carefully. "About how grateful I am that you're here, that I have this chance to be part of your life again." Abigail looked away, her emotions conflicting. "It's still hard, you know, to let you in after everything." "I understand," Edward said gently, "and I don't expect it to be easy. But I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for you and Zoe, for as long as you'll have me." Abigail met his gaze, and for the first time she felt a flicker of trust. "Thank you," she said quietly. That evening, the three of them gathered around a bonfire on the lawn. Zoe roasted marshmallows, her laughter filling the cool night air. Edward and Abigail sat side by side, watching her with matching smiles. "She's so happy," Abigail said, her voice tinged with wonder. "I haven't seen her this carefree in I don't know how long." "She deserves to be happy," Edward said. "And so do you." Abigail glanced at him, her walls lowering just a little more. "Maybe," she said softly, as the fire crackled and the stars emerged overhead. Abigail allowed herself to relax. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace, a peace she wasn't sure she deserved but was beginning to crave. The next morning, as they prepared to return to the city, Zoe hugged Edward tightly. "Can we come back again?" she asked. "Anytime you want," Edward promised, ruffling her hair. Abigail watched the exchange, a small smile playing on her lips, as much as she had resisted Edward's efforts. She couldn't deny the joy he brought to Zoe's life. As they drove back to Manhattan, the countryside fading into the cityscape, Abigail found herself thinking about the future. It wasn't clear yet, but for the first time, it didn't feel as daunting. Edward glanced at her from the front seat. "Thank you for coming this weekend," he said. Abigail met his eyes and nodded. "Thank you for inviting us." The ride continued in comfortable silence, each of them lost in their thoughts. But in that silence, there was a shared understanding, a sense that they were finally moving toward something better. Back in Manhattan, life at the penthouse settled into a steady rhythm. Zoe flourished in her new environment, her days filled with school, playdates, and moments of pure joy with Edward. Abigail, however, remained cautious, her trust in her father growing slowly but still tethered to the scars of the past. Edward continued his quiet efforts to bring Abigail closer, always mindful not to push too hard. He knew the key to healing their relationship was patience, and he was willing to wait as long as it took. But one lingering issue continued to haunt him. David, one afternoon, Edward received a call from James Whitmore, the private investigator. "Edward," James began, his voice low. "I found him, David." Edward's grip on the phone tightened. "Where is he?" "He's in Queens. Working under the table at a mechanic shop," James said. "He's kept a low profile, but I dug up enough to confirm he's been involved in some shady dealings. Gambling debts, unpaid child support, the works." Edward's chest tightened with anger. The thought of this man, who had caused so much pain to Abigail and Zoe, living freely while they had struggled, was infuriating. "I want to meet him," Edward said firmly. James hesitated. "Edward, I don't think that's a good idea. Men like David don't take kindly to being confronted." "I'm not asking for advice," Edward snapped. "Just give me the address." The following day, Edward arrived at the mechanic shop in Queens. The place was grimy and poorly lit, the air thick with the smell of oil and exhaust. Edward spotted David immediately, a wiry man with unkempt hair and a cigarette dangling from his lips. Edward approached him, his presence commanding despite the dingy surroundings. "David," he said, his voice cold and steady. David looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" "Edward Morgan," he replied. "Abigail's father." Recognition flickered across David's face, followed by a sneer. "So the big shot millionaire finally decides to show up. Took you long enough." Edward ignored the jab, his gaze unwavering. "I know what you did to my daughter. The abuse, the abandonment. I came here to make one thing very clear. You will stay away from Abigail and Zoe. Permanently." David let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, is that so? And what makes you think you can tell me what to do?" Edward stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Because if you don't, I will make your life a living hell. I have the resources, the connections, and the will to ensure you never hurt them again. Do you understand me?" David's bravado faltered, but he quickly recovered, puffing out his chest. "You think you scare me?" "You can't control everything, Morgan." Edward's expression darkened. "This isn't about control. It's about protecting my family, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep them safe. Consider this your only warning." Without waiting for a response, Edward turned and walked away, his heart pounding. Confronting David had been a risk, but it was one he had been willing to take for Abigail and Zoe. That evening, Edward returned to the penthouse, his mind still reeling from the confrontation. Abigail was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and Zoe was drawing at the dining table. "How was your day?" Abigail asked casually, glancing at Edward as he entered. "It was productive," he said, carefully masking the tension in his voice. Abigail studied him for a moment, sensing there was more to his answer, but decided not to press. Instead, she handed him a plate. "Dinner's ready." "Zoe insisted on spaghetti, so don't judge my cooking," Edward chuckled, taking the plate. "I'm sure it's perfect." As they sat down to eat, the mood was light and relaxed. Zoe regaled them with stories from school, her laughter filling the room. Edward stole glances at Abigail, marveling at her strength and resilience. Later that night, after Zoe had gone to bed, Abigail approached Edward in the living room. "You seemed off earlier," she said, sitting down across from him. "Is everything okay?" Edward hesitated. He had wanted to shield Abigail from the confrontation with David, but he realized she deserved to know. "I went to see David," he admitted. Abigail's eyes widened. "You did what?" "I needed to make sure he stayed away from you and Zoe," Edward said calmly. "I wanted him to know that he can't hurt you anymore." Abigail stared at him, her emotions warring between anger and gratitude. "You shouldn't have done that," she said finally. "David's dangerous. He could retaliate." "I'm not afraid of him," Edward said firmly, "and I won't let him near you or Zoe ever." Abigail looked away, her jaw tightening. "You don't understand, Dad. Men like David don't just disappear because you tell them to. He'll find a way to cause trouble." "Not if I can help it," Edward said. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect you. That's a promise." Abigail sighed, her defenses wavering. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I've spent years dealing with David, and I know how he operates. Just be careful." Edward nodded, sensing the fear beneath her words. "I will," he said. "But I need you to trust me. Let me handle this." Abigail met his gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Trust is earned, Dad," she said softly. "And you're getting there, but it's going to take time." "I understand," Edward said, "and I'll keep earning it, for as long as it takes." That night, as Edward lay in bed, he replayed the confrontation with David in his mind. He knew the man might retaliate, but he wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, Edward felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a father trying to reconnect with his daughter. He was a protector, a guardian, and he would stop at nothing to ensure Abigail and Zoe were safe. No matter what challenges lay ahead, the next morning, the penthouse was unusually quiet. Abigail sat in the living room with a cup of coffee, staring out the massive windows. The city sprawled beneath her, alive and bustling, but her mind was far away. Edward's revelation about confronting David the night before had stirred a storm of emotions: fear, frustration, and an unexpected sense of relief. She didn't trust easily, and yet Edward's determination to protect her and Zoe was beginning to break through her defenses. Still, the thought of David's potential retaliation loomed large in her mind. She knew what he was capable of, and she didn't want Edward getting caught in his web. Edward joined her a few minutes later, carrying his own cup of coffee. He hesitated at the edge of the room before sitting down across from her. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning," Abigail replied, her voice neutral but not cold. There was a long pause before Edward spoke again. "I know you're upset about what I did," he began, "but I need you to know that I did it for you and Zoe. I couldn't just stand by knowing what he's done to you." Abigail sighed, setting her cup down on the coffee table. "I get it, Dad. I really do. But David's not someone you can intimidate and expect to walk away quietly. He thrives on control, and when he feels like he's losing it, he lashes out. I'll handle whatever comes," Edward assured her. "You don't have to face him alone anymore." Abigail met his gaze, her eyes searching his for sincerity. "I want to believe that," she said quietly. "I really do. But I've spent so long fighting on my own. It's hard to let someone else take the reins." Edward leaned forward, his expression earnest. "You don't have to trust me completely right now, but I hope that in time, you'll see that I'm here for the long haul, for both of you." Abigail nodded slowly, her walls lowering just a fraction. "Time," she echoed. "That's what it'll take." Later that day, Edward surprised Abigail and Zoe with an outing. He had arranged for them to visit a local art exhibit, knowing that Zoe had been exploring her creative side with her drawings. When they arrived at the gallery, Zoe's eyes lit up as she wandered through the exhibits, her small hands reaching out to touch the vibrant sculptures and colorful canvases. Abigail followed closely behind, her own curiosity piqued. "This is amazing," Zoe said, spinning around to take in the towering paintings. "Can I do something like this one day?" "You can do anything you set your mind to," Edward said with a smile. Abigail watched the exchange from a few steps away, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude. Edward's patience and kindness with Zoe were genuine, and she could see how much her daughter adored him. As they moved to another exhibit, Edward leaned toward Abigail. "She has a gift," he said quietly. "Her sketches are incredible for her age." "She's always been creative," Abigail replied, her tone softening. "It's one of the few things that's kept her happy through everything." Edward hesitated, then asked, "Would you let me enroll her in an art program? Something that could help her develop her talent?" Abigail's initial instinct was to say no, to reject the offer out of habit, but as she looked at Zoe, her daughter's face glowing with excitement, she realized it was a chance Zoe deserved. "I'll think about it," Abigail said, her voice cautious but not dismissive. "That's all I ask," Edward replied with a nod. As the day progressed, the three of them began to settle into a natural rhythm. They laughed together, explored the exhibits, and even stopped for ice cream on the way home. Abigail found herself relaxing more than she had in years, the weight of her past momentarily lifting. That evening, as they sat in the living room, Zoe showed Edward her latest drawing, a colorful rendition of their day at the gallery. "This is us," Zoe exclaimed, pointing to the figures on the page. "That's me, and that's Mom, and that's you." Edward smiled, his chest tightening with emotion. "It's perfect," he said. "You're very talented, Zoe." Zoe beamed, her excitement infectious. "Can we hang it on the wall?" "Of course," Edward said. "We'll frame it and put it somewhere special." After Zoe went to bed, Abigail lingered in the kitchen, washing the dishes from their late-night snack. Edward joined her, grabbing a towel to dry the plates. "You don't have to do that," Abigail said, surprised. "I don't mind," Edward replied. "Besides, it's a chance to talk." Abigail glanced at him, her guard still up, but less so than before. "About what?" "About anything," Edward said. "I just want to know more about you, Abigail. The woman you've become, what makes you happy, what you dream about, anything you want to share." Abigail hesitated, her hands pausing mid-wash. "I haven't thought about dreams in a long time," she admitted. "Most of my focus has been on surviving and making sure Zoe is okay." Edward frowned, his heart aching for her. "You deserve to have dreams too," he said. "It's never too late to think about what you want." Abigail's lips curved into a small, almost wistful smile. "Maybe," she said. "But for now, I think I'll focus on Zoe's dreams. She deserves the world." Edward nodded, respecting her choice, but silently vowing to help her rediscover her own aspirations. As the night wore on, Abigail found herself reflecting on the changes in their lives. Edward was far from perfect, but he was trying, and that effort meant more to her than she was ready to admit. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that the bridges they were building could lead to something lasting, something real. Abigail woke early the next morning, the soft light of dawn casting a warm glow over the penthouse. She made her way to the kitchen, hoping for a quiet moment to collect her thoughts before the day began. The weekend had been unexpectedly pleasant, filled with laughter and moments of connection that felt foreign, yet comforting. Still, a lingering sense of unease clung to her. David was a shadow she couldn't shake, and the thought of him potentially resurfacing left her restless. As she sipped her coffee, she heard the faint sound of footsteps. Edward entered the room, already dressed for the day. He paused when he saw her, offering a small smile. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Abigail replied, her voice subdued. Edward poured himself a cup of coffee and joined her at the table. The silence between them was comfortable but tinged with unspoken worries. "You're up early?" Edward observed. "I couldn't sleep," Abigail admitted. "Too much on my mind." Edward nodded, understanding her unspoken concerns. "Is it about David?" Abigail looked down at her cup, her fingers tracing the rim. "I can't help but feel like he's going to show up. He always does when I least expect it." Edward's expression hardened. "If he does, I'll be ready. He won't get near you or Zoe, I promise." Abigail sighed. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Dad. But David isn't just a bad memory. He's a threat, and threats don't go away easily." Edward reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "You're not alone in this anymore, Abigail. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Abigail looked at him, her defenses wavering. "I'm trying to believe that," she said softly that afternoon. As Abigail and Zoe worked on an art project in the living room, Edward received a call from James Whitmore. Stepping into his study, he answered the phone, his tone brisk. "James, what is it?" "Edward, I have news," James said, his voice low. "David's been asking around about Abigail. Word is he knows she's staying with you." Edward's grip on the phone tightened. "How does he know?" "It's unclear," James replied. "But he's been seen in Manhattan. I don't think he'll come quietly." Edward's jaw clenched. "Let me know if you hear anything else, and keep someone on him. I want to know his every move." "Will do," James said before hanging up. Edward sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The thought of David coming anywhere near Abigail or Zoe filled him with a protective rage. He wouldn't let it happen. Later that evening, Edward decided it was time to share what he had learned with Abigail. He found her in Zoe's room, tucking her in for the night. When she joined him in the living room, her expression was curious but cautious. "What's going on?" Abigail asked, sensing his tension. Edward hesitated before speaking. "James called. David knows you're here." Abigail's face paled, her hand instinctively going to her chest. "What? How?" "We're not sure yet," Edward said, "but he's been asking around. I've taken precautions. I have someone keeping tabs on him, but I wanted you to know." Abigail sank onto the couch, her breathing unsteady. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said, her voice trembling. Edward sat beside her, his tone firm but reassuring. "I won't let him hurt you or Zoe. I've already spoken to security. They're on high alert. If he tries anything, he'll be stopped before he gets anywhere near you." Abigail shook her head. "You don't understand, Dad. David doesn't back down. He's manipulative and dangerous. He knows how to get what he wants. And what he wants is control," Edward said. "But he won't get it this time. You're not alone, Abigail. Not anymore." Abigail looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've spent so long fighting him on my own. It's hard to believe I don't have to anymore." "You don't," Edward said softly. "We're in this together." The next few days were tense. Edward made arrangements to increase security around the penthouse, including hiring private guards. Abigail, though still wary, found some solace in knowing that measures were being taken to protect her and Zoe. Zoe, blissfully unaware of the looming threat, continued her days as usual. Her laughter and energy were a welcome distraction for both Edward and Abigail, a reminder of the innocence they were fighting to preserve. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Zoe curled up on the couch with her sketch pad. Abigail and Edward exchanged quiet conversation, their bond strengthening with each shared moment. "I've been thinking about something," Abigail said suddenly. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I want to move forward," Abigail said, her voice steady. "Not just for Zoe, but for me too. I'm tired of living in fear of David. I want to take back control of my life." Edward smiled, pride evident in his expression. "That's a brave decision, Abigail, and I'll do everything I can to help you." Abigail nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "It's time," she said quietly. "It's time to leave the past behind and focus on the future." That night, Edward stood on the balcony, gazing out at the city. The battle ahead with David was inevitable, but for the first time, he felt confident that they could face it together. Abigail's strength inspired him, and Zoe's innocence reminded him of what truly mattered. As the cool night air surrounded him, Edward made a silent vow. No matter what it took, he would protect his family and ensure they could finally find peace. Edward woke early the next morning, the weight of David's looming presence heavy on his mind. He had always been a man of action, someone who confronted problems head-on. But this was different. This wasn't just a business deal or a corporate rival. This was personal, and it involved the two people he cared about most. He was in his study reviewing security protocols when Abigail entered. She looked more composed than he expected, her posture straight, and her expression resolute. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. Edward gestured for her to sit, but Abigail shook her head, choosing to stand. "I've been thinking about what you told me, about David knowing where I am." Edward's chest tightened. "Abigail, I'm doing everything I can to make sure he doesn't get near you or Zoe. You don't need to worry." "That's the problem," Abigail replied, her voice steady but firm. "I do need to worry. This isn't just your fight, Dad. It's mine too. I've spent years running from him and I'm tired of it." Edward frowned. "Edward," concern flashing across his face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to face him," Abigail said. "On my terms, I can't keep living in fear, and I don't want Zoe growing up with that shadow hanging over us." Edward stood, his towering frame casting a protective shadow. "Abigail, I admire your courage. But David isn't someone you can reason with. He's dangerous." "I know that," Abigail said, her voice rising slightly. "But hiding hasn't worked either. If I don't confront him now, he'll keep coming back. He always does." Edward sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I understand where you're coming from, but I can't let you put yourself at risk." "Then don't," Abigail said, softening her tone. "But help me. Be there with me. I need to do this, Dad. For myself, for Zoe." Edward hesitated, torn between his protective instincts and his respect for Abigail's resolve. Finally, he nodded. "If this is what you truly want, I'll support you. But we do this together, with precautions." Abigail gave a small, grateful nod. Together. The next step was to arrange a meeting with David. Edward contacted James, who reluctantly agreed to act as a mediator and ensure the location was secure. They chose a neutral, public place, a quiet cafe with private booths. Abigail spent the hours leading up to the meeting oscillating between calm determination and a gnawing anxiety. Edward stayed close, offering reassurance whenever her resolve faltered. When the time came, they arrived at the cafe together. Abigail's hand gripped Edward's arm tightly as they walked in, her heart pounding. David was already there, sitting in the farthest booth. His presence was as unnerving as Abigail remembered. His posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, scanning her and Edward as they approached. "Well, well," David said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look who finally decided to come out of hiding." Abigail sat down across from him, her back straight and her expression neutral. Edward took the seat beside her, his presence a silent but commanding force. "We're not here for games, David," Abigail said, her tone calm but firm. "This ends now." David leaned back, smirking. "Ends, sweetheart. You don't get to decide when this ends. You owe me, and I don't walk away empty-handed." Edward's jaw tightened, but he let Abigail lead. "I don't owe you anything," she said, her voice steady. "You lost any claim to me or Zoe the day you laid a hand on me. I'm not scared of you anymore." David's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "You think you're so brave now, huh? Hiding behind Daddy's money?" Edward leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Watch your tone, David. You're talking to the mother of my granddaughter and my daughter. You've done enough damage, and you're not getting another chance." David glared at Edward, his bravado wavering. "What do you want from me?" Abigail took a deep breath. "I want you to leave us alone. Permanently. No more showing up. No more threats. No more interference. If you agree, we'll stay out of your life too." David scoffed. "And if I don't?" Edward's expression hardened. "Then I'll make sure you regret it. I've already collected enough information to ensure you spend years in prison if you push this any further." David's eyes flickered with uncertainty. He was calculating, weighing his options. "You think you can scare me with threats?" David asked, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "They're not threats," Edward said coldly. "They're promises. Walk away, David. This is your last chance." The tension in the air was thick as David sat silently, his jaw clenched. Finally, he let out a bitter laugh. "Fine," he said, throwing his hands up in mock surrender. "I'm done. You can have your perfect little life, but don't think this is over." "It is," Abigail said firmly, standing. "For me, it is." Edward rose with her, his presence unwavering. Together, they left the cafe, leaving David behind, back at the penthouse. Abigail let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "It's over," she whispered, as if saying the words aloud would make them real. Edward placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You were incredible, Abigail. You stood up to him, and you didn't let him win." Abigail nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you. You didn't need me," Edward said softly. "You've always had that strength. I just gave you the chance to use it." As Abigail hugged him tightly, Edward felt a profound sense of pride. His daughter had faced her fears, and together, they had taken a monumental step toward healing. But deep down, Edward knew that while David might be out of their lives for now, the scars he had left would take time to fade, and Edward was determined to help Abigail and Zoe heal. No matter how long it took, the days following the confrontation with David were strangely quiet. For Abigail, the silence felt surreal, a reminder that the chaos and fear that had shadowed her life for so long might finally be over. Edward, ever vigilant, continued to keep security measures in place, unwilling to take any chances. Zoe, blissfully unaware of the gravity of the situation, carried on as usual. Her laughter echoed through the penthouse as she painted and played, her bright energy a beacon for both Abigail and Edward. One evening, after Zoe had gone to bed, Abigail and Edward sat in the living room, the city lights casting a soft glow through the windows. Abigail leaned back on the couch, exhaustion etched on her face. "Thank you," she said quietly, breaking the silence. Edward looked at her, surprised. "For what?" "For standing by me," Abigail replied. "For being there when I needed you. I didn't think I could face him, but you made me believe I could." Edward's expression softened. "You give me too much credit. That strength was always yours, Abigail. I just reminded you it was there." Abigail smiled faintly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It feels strange," she admitted. "Not looking over my shoulder, not waiting for the next crisis. I don't know how to just be. Edward leaned forward, his voice gentle. You don't have to figure it out all at once. Take it one day at a time. You've been fighting for so long. It's okay to let yourself breathe now. Abigail nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I want that. For me, and for Zoe. I want her to grow up feeling safe and loved. She will, Edward said firmly, and so will you. The following weekend, Edward surprised Abigail and Zoe with a day trip to the countryside estate they had visited before. He hoped the fresh air and peaceful surroundings would help them relax and create new memories, unburdened by the weight of the past. As they arrived, Zoe squealed with excitement, running toward the stables where her favorite horse waited. Abigail trailed behind, her steps slower but her expression lighter than it had been in weeks. Edward watched as Zoe mounted the horse with the help of a trainer, her laughter ringing out as the animal trotted around the paddock. Abigail stood at the fence, a small smile playing on her lips. She's so happy here, Edward said, joining her. Abigail nodded. It's like she belongs here, away from all the noise and chaos. Edward hesitated, then said, This could be your life. You know, not just a weekend escape, but something permanent. Abigail looked at him, surprised. What are you saying? I'm saying I want you and Zoe to have everything you deserve, Edward said. A home where you feel safe, a future filled with possibilities. This estate is as much yours as it is mine. If you ever wanted to stay here, it's yours. Abigail stared at him, her emotions swirling. That's a generous offer, Dad, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of change. You don't have to decide now, Edward said gently. Just know that it's an option, whatever you need to build the life you want. I'm here to support you. Abigail nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, she said softly. As the day wore on, the three of them spent time exploring the estate. They walked through the gardens, shared a picnic under a towering oak tree, and laughed as Zoe tried, and failed, to catch butterflies. For the first time in years, Abigail felt a sense of peace, not the fleeting kind, but something deeper, something she dared to hope might last. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with shades of orange and pink, the family sat together on the porch of the estate's main house. Zoe was curled up in Edward's lap, her eyelids drooping as sleep threatened to overtake her. Abigail watched the scene with a quiet smile. She's going to be asking to come back here every weekend now, she teased. Edward chuckled. She's welcome any time, so are you. Abigail's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a more contemplative expression. It's hard to believe this is our life now, she said. For so long it felt like I was stuck in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Edward reached over, placing a comforting hand on hers. That nightmare is over, Abigail. And from now on, it's about building something better, together. Abigail looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and hope. Together, she echoed. That night, as they drove back to the city, Abigail reflected on the day, the laughter, the connection, the absence of fear. It all felt like the beginning of something new. For so long, she had been focused on survival, but now, she could finally see a future worth fighting for. Zoe stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly as she leaned against Abigail. Edward glanced at them from the driver's seat, his heart swelling with pride and love. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time the path ahead felt clear, and for Edward, Abigail, and Zoe, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Abigail and Zoe began to settle into a life that felt increasingly stable and full of possibilities. Abigail found herself letting go of the constant tension that had ruled her life for so long. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the future, not just for Zoe, but for herself as well. Edward, ever patient, continued to offer his unwavering support. He respected Abigail's independence, but made it clear that she and Zoe were now the center of his world. He wanted to be a constant presence, not just a fleeting figure from their past. One morning, Edward invited Abigail to his study after breakfast. She entered cautiously, curious about what he wanted to discuss. I've been thinking, Edward began, motioning for her to sit. It's clear you have a gift for resilience and problem solving. Have you ever considered going back to school or pursuing a career you're passionate about? Abigail blinked. caught off guard. "I haven't really thought about it," she admitted. "My focus has always been on Zoe and making ends meet." Edward leaned forward, his tone gentle but encouraging. "You've spent so much time putting everyone else first. I think it's time you consider what you want. You're capable of so much." "Abigail, the world is wide open for you now." Abigail hesitated, his words stirring something deep within her. "I don't even know where to start," she confessed. "Start small," Edward suggested. "Think about what excites you, or what you've always been curious about. There's no rush, and whatever path you choose, I'll be here to support you." Abigail nodded slowly, her mind racing with possibilities. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond mere survival. That afternoon, Abigail took Zoe to the park, something they had done often since moving in with Edward. As Zoe played on the swings, Abigail sat on a nearby bench, her thoughts drifting. She remembered how much she used to love writing, how she would fill notebooks with stories and ideas as a child. It had been years since she had picked up a pen for anything other than bills or school forms, but the memory of her love for storytelling resurfaced like an old friend. When Zoe ran over, breathless and beaming, Abigail hugged her tightly. "How about we stop by the library on the way home?" she asked. Zoe's eyes lit up. "Can I get new books?" "Of course," Abigail said, smiling. "And maybe I'll get some for myself too." That evening, Abigail sat in her room with a blank notebook in front of her. The pen in her hand felt foreign but familiar, like a long-lost piece of herself. She hesitated for a moment before letting the words flow. The act of writing was cathartic, a way to process everything she had been through, and everything she hoped to become. Page after page, she poured out her thoughts, her fears and her dreams. When she finally looked up, hours had passed, and her heart felt lighter. Edward noticed the change in Abigail almost immediately. She seemed more relaxed, her laughter coming more freely. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, he asked her about it. "I've been writing," she admitted, a shy smile on her lips. Edward's eyes lit up. "That's wonderful. What are you writing about?" "Everything," Abigail said. "The past, the present, what I want for the future. It's helping me make sense of things." Edward nodded, his admiration for her growing. "You have a gift, Abigail. I hope you keep at it. Who knows where it might lead." The weeks turned into months, and life began to take on a rhythm that felt almost normal. Abigail started attending a local writing workshop, encouraged by Edward and inspired by her own growing confidence. Zoe continued to thrive, her boundless energy a source of joy for everyone around her. One evening, Edward gathered Abigail and Zoe in the living room. He held a small box in his hands, his expression a mix of excitement and nervousness. "I wanted to give you something," he said, addressing both of them. He opened the box to reveal two delicate necklaces, each with a small engraved pendant. Abigail's had the word strength, and Zoe's had the word joy. "These are for you," Edward said, "to remind you both of what you've brought into my life. Abigail, your strength has inspired me in ways I can't even put into words. And Zoe, your joy has brought light to my world. I'm so grateful for both of you." Abigail's eyes filled with tears as she took the necklace. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly. "This means more than you know." Zoe threw her arms around Edward's neck, her giggle muffled against his shoulder. "I love it, Grandpa." Edward hugged her tightly, his heart full. That night, Abigail sat on her balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance. She fingered the pendant around her neck, her thoughts drifting to the journey that had brought her here. For the first time in years, she felt truly hopeful. The ghosts of her past no longer held the power they once had. She had reclaimed her life, and with Edward and Zoe by her side, she knew the future held endless possibilities. As she stood and stepped back inside, she felt a quiet sense of triumph. This was her story, and for the first time, she was the one writing it. The crisp spring air carried a sense of renewal as Abigail, Edward, and Zoe gathered on the balcony of the penthouse, overlooking a city that buzzed with life. It was a day of celebration, though not for any formal reason. It was a day to mark how far they had come as a family. Zoe ran circles around the balcony, holding a sketchbook in one hand and a pencil in the other. She paused every now and then to show Edward her latest masterpiece, her joy infectious. Abigail watched her daughter, a soft smile on her face, her hands resting on the railing as she let the cool breeze wash over her. "You've done an amazing job with her," Edward said, stepping up beside Abigail. "She's the reason I've kept going," Abigail replied, her voice filled with emotion. "But I couldn't have done this without you. Dad, you've given us a chance I never thought we'd have." Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression serious but kind. "You gave me a chance too, Abigail. You let me be part of your life again, and I'll never take that for granted." The day unfolded with a sense of peace that had once felt impossible. They ventured out to Central Park, where Zoe raced ahead to the duck pond, her laughter ringing out like a melody. Edward and Abigail walked behind, their conversation easy and natural. "You've changed," Abigail said suddenly, glancing at Edward. Edward raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Changed how?" "You're softer," she said, her tone teasing but sincere. "More open, more present. I guess I didn't expect that from the man I remembered." Edward chuckled. "Losing you and Zoe's mother changed me, Abigail. It made me realize how empty my life was without the people I loved, and finding you again. It's given me a second chance to get it right." Abigail nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I think we've both found a second chance. It's strange, isn't it? How life can fall apart and then rebuild in ways you never expected." Edward smiled. "Strange, but also beautiful." That evening, back at the penthouse, Edward surprised Abigail and Zoe with a family dinner. The table was set with their favorite dishes, candles flickering in the soft light. Zoe's eyes lit up as she took her seat. "This is so fancy," Abigail laughed, shaking her head. "It's just dinner, sweetie." "But it's special," Edward said, his tone warm, "because we're together." As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and memories. Edward listened intently as Abigail shared stories from her writing workshop, her passion shining through. Zoe chimed in with tales of her latest adventures at school, her excitement filling the room. For Edward, it was a moment of pure contentment. He had spent so many years focused on building his empire, thinking it would bring him fulfillment. But sitting at the table with his daughter and granddaughter, he realized that this, family, connection, love, was what truly mattered. After dinner, Edward called for everyone's attention. "There's something I want to say," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Abigail and Zoe looked at him expectantly, their expressions curious. "I've spent most of my life trying to control everything," Edward said. "But the truth is, life has a way of humbling you. Losing Sarah and thinking I'd lost you. Abigail was the hardest thing I've ever endured, but finding you again, it's been the greatest gift I could have ever hoped for." Abigail's eyes filled with tears as Edward continued. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to build a future where we never lose each other again. A future where Zoe grows up knowing she's loved and supported, and where you, Abigail, can follow your dreams without fear." He turned to Zoe, his smile widening. "And you, young lady, are going to keep creating those amazing drawings and chasing your dreams too." Zoe giggled, throwing her arms around Edward. "I will, Grandpa." Abigail wiped her tears, her voice shaky but steady. "Thank you, Dad, for everything, for showing me that it's never too late to heal." Edward reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Thank you for letting me back in. You and Zoe have given me a reason to live again." Later that night, after Zoe had gone to bed, Abigail joined Edward on the balcony. The city lights shimmered below, and the air was filled with the sounds of life moving forward. "I was scared when we first came here," Abigail admitted. "I didn't know if I could trust you or if this would even work. But now, I can't imagine not having you in our lives." Edward smiled, his gaze warm. "You'll always have me, Abigail. That's a promise." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past finally beginning to lift. For Abigail, this was the start of a new chapter, one where she wasn't defined by her struggles, but by her resilience. For Edward, it was a chance to embrace the family he thought he had lost, to live with purpose and love. And for Zoe, it was the foundation of a life filled with joy, security, and endless possibilities. As the city continued to buzz around them, the three of them knew they had found something rare and precious, a new beginning.